Welcome everyone. Let's dive right into today's urgent public health explainer. We're looking closely at the rising global threat of orthohantaviruses. This is a pathogen that's just been quietly expanding its footprint, and honestly, with recent clinical developments and shifting outbreak patterns, it is absolutely critical that we, the medical community, are fully briefed on the current risks and, of course, the cutting-edge countermeasures coming down the pipeline.
So let's kick this off with a pretty staggering statistic. 50%. That is the case fatality rate that Hantavirus Pulmonary Syndrome, or HPS, can actually reach in human populations. Just to put that into perspective, the majority of patients who develop severe HPS can succumb within just 1 to 2 days after hospital admission. So yeah, this is definitely not some theoretical risk. We are talking about a rapid, highly lethal clinical reality.
Because of that extreme mortality rate, and frankly, the total lack of specific post-exposure antiviral treatments, the World Health Organization has actually designated hantavirus as a potential disease X pathogen, meaning it's a pathogen of the highest concern for future pandemics. It really forces us to ask a difficult question, right? Are our global health systems, our diagnostic protocols, and our preventative measures actually prepared for a widespread outbreak?
And as you'll see here, the expanding worldwide distribution of orthohantavirus infections over the last century paints a very clear picture of why that preparation is just so vital. What started out as these isolated regional clusters has basically exploded globally. Decades of human encroachment into wildlife habitats, massive landscape modifications, and climate change driving up rodent populations, all of this has fueled a rapidly expanding geographic footprint. The virus is completely moving beyond its old boundaries, which means more and more clinicians worldwide are inevitably going to encounter it.
Moving on to Section 1, the Orthohantavirus clinical threat.
To quickly establish our clinical baseline, we really need to recognize the stark contrast between the two primary syndromes caused by this viral family. On one side of the table, we've got the old world hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, or HFRS. We primarily see this in Asia and Europe. It accounts for over 20,000 cases annually, carrying a fatality rate of up to 15%, and it focuses heavily on acute kidney injury. Now on the flip side, we have the New World Hantavirus Pulmonary Syndrome, or HPS, found over in the Americas. While it's definitely less common, its clinical focus is severe pulmonary edema and shock, and that is exactly what drives that absolutely devastating fatality rate of up to 50%.
Next up, Section 2, transmission routes and outbreaks. So traditionally, we view orthohantaviruses as strictly zoonotic, right? The primary reservoir hosts are rodents, and the virus gets transmitted to us humans mostly through exposure to aerosolized rodent urine, feces, and saliva. Animal bites do happen, sure, but they're pretty infrequent. But here's where it gets really interesting and concerning. While traditional transmission relies heavily on that environmental contact, one specific New World strain, the Andes virus, completely breaks the standard pattern. As public health professionals, what we really need to take away from this is the deeply alarming, thoroughly documented reality of person-to-person transmission. The International Hantavirus Society highlighted this unique threat with the Andes virus. Look at the 2018 to 2019 Epinizzian outbreak in Argentina. An incredible 34 confirmed cases were linked back to just a single index case. It was driven entirely by close contact settings and social events. And now authorities are actually investigating a deeply concerning outbreak linked to the cruise ship Hondius. We are literally seeing super spreaders and close contact amplification that mimics what you'd expect from a standard respiratory virus.
Which brings us to Section 3, current inactivated vaccine use.
Given this evolving transmission reality we just talked about, we definitely need to critically examine our current medical countermeasures. Tracking the evolution of orthohantavirus vaccines actually takes us all the way back to 1990, when South Korea first approved Hantavex, an inactivated vaccine. Then, by 2003, China incorporated a bivalent vaccine into their expanded program on immunization. But take a look at the gap right after that, followed by this recent flurry of activity. In 2018, the Hantavex regimen actually had to be bumped up from 3 to 4 doses just to maintain its efficacy. Fast forward to the 2020s, and we're seeing major leaps forward with mRNA collaborations and structural mapping. We're finally shifting from these legacy inactivated platforms right into precision bioengineering.
Now, the currently deployed inactivated vaccines have for sure played a crucial role in reducing incidence in Asia, but let's be honest, they have some pretty major limitations. They suffer from weak immunogenicity, which is why they require up to 4 doses. And crucially, not a single orthohantavirus vaccine has received WHO approval. So the unmet global need here is just massive. We desperately need a vaccine that offers broad-spectrum protection against both Old World and New World strains, elicits a rapid onset of neutralizing antibodies, and most importantly, is actually cleared for global deployment.
Let's move into Section 4, mapping the virus structure. To close that massive gap in our global defense, scientists realized they had to understand the enemy at a nanoscale level. Now, what's really interesting here is how overlaying the virus's precise structure with our body's temporal immune response reveals a crucial vulnerability. Looking at the variant on the left, it's an enveloped virus with a tri-segment RNA genome encapsulated by nucleocapsid proteins, and most critically, it has this outer layer of glycoproteins known as GN and GC. Then, checking out the temporal dynamics on the right, you can see exactly how our antibodies react. While IgM spikes pretty early, those surface glycoproteins generally provoke a pretty weak, delayed IgG neutralizing antibody response in the host. The takeaway? To make a better vaccine, we have to find a way to target those specific outer glycoproteins much more effectively.
And that brings us to a massive breakthrough that was actually just published in the journal Cell. Researchers over at UT Austin have successfully mapped the 3D structure of the GN-GC tetramer. Basically, this is the mushroom-shaped surface protein complex that the virus uses to fuse with host cells. By mapping it in its pre-infection state using cryo-electron microscopy, scientists finally have the exact blueprint they need. It's literally the key to designing synthetic antigens that can lock the virus out before it ever even enters a cell.
Which perfectly sets up Section 5, Next Generation Vaccine Pipeline. Armed with this incredible new structural data, the pipeline for a universal, highly effective vaccine is just accelerating so rapidly right now. Researchers are actively pursuing a few advanced platforms. First up, we're seeing recombinant DNA vaccines that utilize fusion techniques to directly target antigen-presenting cells. Then, second, there's a development of virus-like particles, or VLPs. These basically engineer safe chimeric structures that look exactly like the virus to our immune system, but they completely lack any infectious nucleic acids. And finally, we have what is arguably the most promising frontier, mRNA technology. This leverages rapid design and production cycles to elicit incredibly robust T-cell and neutralizing antibody responses.
So, this brings us right to the leading edge of current clinical efforts. Notably, the Vaccine Innovation Center at Korea University has officially partnered with Moderna through their global mRNA Access program. They are actively taking all that hantavirus antigen sequence information and utilizing Moderna's preclinical mRNA technology. The goal? To develop a true pan-hantavirus vaccine. We're talking about a vaccine designed from the ground up to be effective against a much wider range of both old and new world strains than anything we've ever seen before.
The science is moving at an absolutely unprecedented pace, but so is the environment. I want to leave you with this final thought to consider in your clinical practice. Can our next-generation vaccine pipeline really outpace an evolving pathogen whose footprint grows larger every single day? I mean, how will climate change and human encroachment shift these transmission maps before a universal, WHO-approved vaccine is actually ready for the public? It's a real race against time. Stay vigilant. Absolutely keep this pathogen on your diagnostic radar, and thank you so much for joining us for this urgent explainer briefing.
Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. I'm an epidemiologist over here at the CDC, and a huge part of my day-to-day is staring at data, tracking how diseases spread, and honestly, the most important part, translating super complex health protocols into stuff that actually makes sense for the rest of us. So today, we're zooming in on the current risk assessment and the public health response to the hantavirus outbreak that's been linked to the MV Handias cruise ship. We're going to completely break down what's happening on the ground, how we're mathematically managing the risks, and the exact protocols we've locked in place to keep everyone safe.
First things first, I really want to emphasize that the absolute top priority of the U.S. government, working right alongside our international partners, is getting these passengers and crew members home safely, period. And to pull that off, our response is being driven by rigorous, hard data. We're leaning directly on the official CDC interim guidance here. Every single step we take is meticulously planned out to contain the virus, take care of the folks affected, and, without a doubt, keep the broader public totally safe. Okay, let's dive right in. We're going to break this down step by step using a classic epidemiological framework. We'll hit the outbreak status, profile the pathogen itself, talk about how we stratify exposure risk, look at the evacuation protocols, and wrap things up with a 42-day monitoring plan. All right, part 1, outbreak status and the bottom line. So here's the reality of the situation. We are managing a massively complex logistical and medical operation centered around roughly 150 passengers and crew, and they're not all from one place. This cohort comes from 23 different countries. They recently disembarked the MV Handias over in the Canary Islands, just off the coast of Spain.
Now, here are the raw facts. This outbreak has resulted in at least 8 confirmed cases, and tragically, that does include 3 deaths. Plus, since the initial evacuation, we've actually seen new positive tests pop up. Specifically, we've had American and French evacuees who either developed mild symptoms or tested positive during their heavily monitored trips back home. I know, seeing numbers like that, it's completely natural to feel your anxiety spike, especially with the pandemic fatigue we're all carrying around right now. But I really want you to hear what the World Health Organization Director General, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, explicitly said about this. He stated, "This is not another COVID, and the risk to the public is low. We need to stop any panic right in its tracks. Yes, our public health systems are on high alert, but the actual threat to your local community is extremely low. And I'm going to show you exactly why that is, through the science." Moving on to Section 2, profiling the pathogen. So to fight an outbreak, you really have to demystify the bug you're dealing with. The culprit in this case is the Andes hantavirus. Now, usually hantavirus is spread when a person inhales aerosolized particles from infected rodent droppings. Pretty standard stuff. But what makes the Andes strain so unique, and honestly why this cruise ship triggered such a massive global response, is that it is the only hantavirus we know of that can actually spread from person to person. But, and this is a critical but, unlike those highly contagious respiratory viruses like COVID, human-to-human transmission of the Andes virus is incredibly rare. It basically requires prolonged, super close contact or direct exposure to bodily fluids. It's not just floating around the grocery store. Because of that, the magic number you really need to remember here is 42. In epidemiology, nailing down the incubation period is literally everything. The Andes virus has a median incubation of about 18 days. That's when most folks would start feeling sick. But it can stretch out to a maximum of 42 days before symptoms show up. That specific biological ticking clock absolutely dictates the entire framework of our public health response and how long we have to monitor people. Which brings us right into Section 3, stratifying exposure risk. You see, we don't just guess who might get sick. Epidemiologists scientifically classify every single returning passenger and crew member. It's a mathematically grounded system to figure out the exact right level of monitoring. The CDC criteria here are incredibly specific. We bucket folks into high-risk versus low-risk contacts. A high-risk contact? That's someone who was on the ship from the day the first patient showed symptoms, or someone who was within 6 feet of a sick person in an enclosed space for 15 cumulative minutes. Sharing a cabin or sitting within 2 seats on an airplane also puts you in that high-risk bucket. If you don't hit those very strict criteria, you're stratified into the low-risk category, which completely changes what your isolation looks like. All right, Section 4, evacuation protocols. Once we identified the pathogen and mapped out the risk levels, an unprecedented, tightly controlled international containment effort kicked off to get these folks home. The visuals of this disembarkation in Tenerife were honestly pretty striking, but entirely necessary. It played out in 4 main steps. First off, mandatory N95 or FFP2 masking for every single person on that ship. Second, getting them off the docks using specially prepped Spanish Army buses equipped with physical barriers. Third, a literal tarmac disinfection, where evacuees were sprayed down with disinfectants by teams in blue hazmat suits. And finally, boarding everyone onto highly specialized biocontainment medical charter flights. And listen, none of this was improvised. These steps were globally coordinated by authorities following strict WHO guidelines for safe disembarkation. That guidance dictates everything, making sure screening areas maintain a strict 1-meter physical distance, requiring separate ventilation systems if they're indoors, and ensuring that all medical and screening staff are in full personal protective equipment. So this highly controlled operation on the tarmac fed seamlessly into the international repatriation phase. And every nation stepped up with the same level of rigor. For the U.S., 17 Americans were flown into Offutt Air Force Base to be monitored at the premier national quarantine unit in Nebraska. And get this, anyone showing symptoms was actually isolated inside specialized biocontainment units while they were still on the airplane. Talk about airtight logistics. Meanwhile, Canada moved its citizens to a supervised federal facility in BC, Spain used biosafety isolation beds at a military hospital in Madrid, and France put their evacuees into strict immediate isolation upon landing. And finally, Section 5, the 42-day monitoring plan. This is where the rubber really meets the road. These day-to-day safety measures guarantee that if a new case does pop up, we catch it instantly, long before it could ever threaten the broader community. For high-risk contacts who are approved to manage this at home, the rules are ironclad. The not recommended list is pretty much what you'd expect. No sharing a bed, no sharing utensils or towels, and absolutely no social events. Instead, we highly recommend delaying any non-essential medical care, using a private bathroom, and masking up with a respirator if you absolutely have to be around others in the house. They seem like simple tweaks, but these targeted modifications literally halt the chain of infection in its tracks. And hand in hand with those home modifications is the daily symptom monitoring. Public health departments are checking in every single day, vigilantly tracking a very specific set of indicators. We're looking out for a fever over 104 degrees, a weird new headache, sudden muscle or back pain, gastrointestinal stuff like nausea or diarrhea, or a new cough. If an individual's condition shifts even a little bit and triggers one of these alerts, boom, rapid isolation and testing protocols are initiated immediately. Now, if you happen to live in one of the communities receiving these travelers, it's okay to feel a little uneasy. But I want to firmly reassure you by highlighting this fantastic quote from Dr. Bonnie Henry, British Columbia's provincial health officer. She said it unequivocally. At no point during their arrival or isolation period will they be in contact with the public. The isolation barriers we've set up, from the military bases all the way down to the daily home checks, are absolute. They work. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought. We're successfully managing this crisis right now because the Andes virus, as nasty as it is, requires very close contact to spread. We got a little lucky there. But it really forces us to ask, if our global systems can flawlessly coordinate to contain a rare 42-day threat like this one, are those same protocols fast and robust enough to prevent the next highly transmissible airborne pandemic? It's literally the question that keeps epidemiologists like me up at night, and it's exactly why practicing and perfecting these rigorous, data-driven safety measures is so unbelievably crucial. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today to dig into the science and the real strategy behind the headlines. Stay safe out there.